A good morning to the Caron Chapel YouTube audience, and another good morning to everybody here. Thanks for the opportunity to be with you all this morning, and anybody watching on live stream or on campus. Little drama just here before. The message begins with a story, true story from my early recovery. Some degree of embarrassment, but here we go. I was into my sobriety. I had gone through a series of sponsors without really getting traction in the 12-step methods that have propelled me these long years, continue to serve me in such a great way. And it's one of these things, just like I don't learn to speak French in a week or 28 days, it takes a significant amount of time to acquire the wisdom and etiquette and culture and practices of these things. So I was learning about the 12-step thing. I was going to meetings, and at that time I was a small business owner. My mother had helped me start a business, and one of my least favorite aspects of that business was accounts receivable, which was the management of debt that people owed us for the things that we sold them. And at this time I was actually trying to be a really sharper business person because sobriety had, made me want to do whatever I was doing with better skill. And I ended up in this conflict with a fellow whose first name was Bob. And he owed me money. And he was a private contractor, or he owed the business money. And at different times we would take people to small claims court. We never had large enough sums to really involve lawyers and get in the really big sphere. This was a tiny little business. But at the same time, in that period of time, I was also, which I still do today, when I can keep all these plates spinning here, I was into fitness and wellness for the first time in my life. I was going to the gym, and I was trying to take care of myself, and I was not drinking, and I was trying to be a better business guy. And as it happened, where I would go to the gym was the YMCA in a small town, and in the early mornings, I had a very routine sort of thing, and I would go in, and when you walked to the locker room, you had to walk by this big glass front, and right on the opposite side of the glass were the aerobics machines, the ellipticals and the treadmills and all that sort of stuff. And as it happened frequently on a Monday or Wednesday or whatever it was, Tuesday, Thursday, when I was walking there, Bob would be on one of these things. And I would be like, I hate this man. I never used that word, but he came to be like the object of my, it was like despicable him, bleh. And at the same time, I'm learning the steps, and I had heard this thing in meetings, which was, this is a common teaching in the 12-step circles. I think it does have a basis in the literature somewhere, but the recommendation is, if you're wrestling with a resentment with someone, you should pray for them every day for 2 weeks and watch what happens. So first of all, I had started my recovery as an atheist, so I wasn't even comfortable with the prayer notion. But by this point, I had been experimenting with prayer and meditation. I had a sponsor's name was Tom. This man, I just owe so much of my life to him. And I was telling Tom about this stuff, and I'm like, Tom, I go to the gym in the morning, and I see Bob, and and I just want to have a big red marker and go, I hate you, in backwards lettering on the glass. And Tom said, have you tried have you used the method? And I was like, what method? Plain dumb. And he goes, I think, it'd be helpful. Tom was one of those gentle sponsors. He would always offer suggestions, but I also have learned in the etiquette, if any of you are doing this thing, when your sponsor offers a suggestion, it's a command. And it's just manipulation. So he's like, I wonder if you'd be willing to give experiment with this thing that many people have found very helpful, which is to pray for Bob every day for 2 weeks, right? And I'm like, this is Jack at the scene. I'm like, how about if I pray that he gets what he deserves? True story. And I remember Tom, like, Jack, if that's the best you got, start there. So I've had a series of spiritual experiences over the course of my 34 years of abstinence, going from atheism to what you see today. And this was one of them. I had a mission assignment from my sponsor, Tom, to pray for Bob. I had an intention to follow through on it. I already had developed this thing. I was a little nervous and embarrassed about it, but I was praying on my knees. And I was doing it in the morning and the evening. Just keep part of that's the recommended pattern in this recovery movement. So the next time I was getting ready to pray, I got on my knees. I remember this almost as if it was like yesterday. And I had in my mind, because I thought it was funny as hell, I was going to pray that Bob gets me. At the same time, I was going to the county correctional facility on Tuesday night with my brother, who is still clean and sober, and James and I were facilitating the Narcotics Anonymous meeting in this correctional institution. And those two contexts collided with me as I was on my knees at the side of the bed. Because every time I would go on Tuesday nights into SCI, it was called, I would think, I should be locked up here. I sold drugs. I did other really inappropriate things. I used illegal substances. There were just tons of reasons why I felt this incredible weirdness about and hearing the doors lock in the jail and being with these men and having these really incredible meetings. Of course, there was a crew at the back who were just like not really participating, but there was a small group of people in the institution who were really hungry for understanding what recovery could be. I loved that meeting. And then I could get up and leave. And it was on the departure from the institution. I would think, God, I'm so glad I am not in there. So the point is, I'm kneeling on the side of the bed and I'm thinking, what if I got what I deserve? I couldn't do it. I could not pray that Bob would get what he deserved. It was like a Grinch moment, you know? Heart through 3 times. And I'm choking up. So I prayed that night that Bob would get love and light and peace and joy, because I wanted that. And over the next 2 weeks, as I would go to the YMCA, and Bob was either there or not, what shifted in me was my rage became pity. I started feeling sorry for him and thinking, because I knew certain details about his family, and I was like, ugh. All of a sudden it became plausible to me that he was maybe just as broken and imperfect as I was. And that this really wasn't about me. It was about paperclips, office supplies. It was why I was taking this thing so personally. All of a sudden it also became clear to me. It was a thing. But anyway, this was a really important moment in my journey. And I continue, when I find myself at odds with people, to practice this aspect of the recovery movement's core tradition. And what I thought of as I was thinking this week about telling that story was this connection between rage and pity. And I'm headed somewhere, and the next jump I want to make, I'm going to borrow from one of my favorite spiritual writers of all time. You might not think of him as a spiritual writer, but J.R.R. Tolkien. And Tolkien's Lord of the Rings is like a prized piece of literature in my life. And I've studied about it, and it's just as much rooted in theology and faith as really the 12 steps are, without the explicit naming of a particular tradition. And in fact, Tolkien and C.S. Lewis used to fight about that, argue in writing. You can see it in their letters, because the C.S. Lewis writings were so explicitly Christian. And Tolkien was like, I specifically pulled that back from, because he was interested in the Nordic and all that sort of stuff. So anyway, I'm such a nerd. So, but there are characters in the Lord of the Rings, Frodo, Bilbo, and Sam. All of them carry this burden. And each of them has as a kind of a nemesis, Gollum. And there are instances in the narrative, in each of the 3 instances, when each of them has the chance to smite Gollum. And although my topic is mercy, and writers who have written about this talk about this as Sam, Frodo, and Bilbo practicing mercy, in the text, Gandalf says pity stayed their hand. Pity. I I think it's fair for me to say I felt merciful towards Bob. And that's what I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about mercy in a way I've not talked about in the chapel before, because this is a topic that comes up every 18 or 19 weeks, and it's a topic I dearly love. I was influenced by hearing a woman in Pittsburgh, Ellen Mady, speak on mercy a number of years ago, and ever since I added it to my topic rotation, and her teaching on mercy was brilliant and beautiful, but I'm headed in a different direction. So with the help of my former adversary, Bob, and the thought that pity and mercy are connected. What I discovered in trying to get ready for today was that there was a simple way for me to think about mercy and how mercy is distinguished from, in my seminary education, I got a ton of education about grace. And we throw grace and mercy together. Practical theologians do that all the time. And there's something correlated with it. But the simple distinction is grace is getting something you don't deserve, and mercy is not getting something that you deserve. Right? So mercy is being spared a punishment, and grace is an unexpected blessing. And so they're both great things. Who wouldn't want either of those things? But let's talk a little bit about the due consequences. So where mercy jumps into play is when anybody might think you should be on the hook for something. You have a price to pay for what you've done. You've been a bad boy, kind of thing, right? And there, it could be legal, it could be familial, it could be theological in terms of this idea of sin, it could be all these kind of things. But I don't know if you've ever been bad, but I've been bad a number of times in my life, and I have feared the consequences of what it is, what is coming my way because of what I have done. And let me stay in nerd lane for a minute. When I went from atheist to seminarian, and in seminary I learned about the Abrahamic traditions and specifically about Christianity, but I'll extend what I'm about to say to Judaism and Islam. So in Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, there's a legal tradition that goes way, way back. It's called, in the Latin, lex talionis. I don't know if any of you have heard of lex talionis, but it's a basic principle that is articulated in the book of Exodus as an eye for an eye. Lex talionis is usually translated as the law of retaliation. And the idea is that punishment ought to be commensurate with crime. Doesn't always work out that way, right? In fact, one of the things that was very difficult for me in my development as a pastor was at a time when, this is history, some of you are old enough to remember it, in the 1990s, when Colin Powell was taking the American forces into Iraq and developed a doctrine which was called shock and awe. And the notion was that we would obliterate, basically, Iraq in a few days, show them our extraordinary might and power, and that would resolve it. I had a friend who was a military person. He was like, Jack, we'll be in and out of there in a week. That was like COVID, 2 weeks, right? It turned out to be completely incorrect. But also, it was, in my mind, fundamentally unethical. Because there's teachings about war. There's a really interesting thing that comes out of the 14th, 15th centuries called the just war tradition, in which Aquinas and others thinking about war said, if we have to go to war, what's in and out of bounds? And one of the things that the just war tradition has held over the West for centuries, and most countries in the United Nations and all this have kowtowed somewhat to it's a funny Asian overlay, but to the notion of the just war tradition is commensurate response. That if you encroach on our territory, we will hit back, but roughly in some way that's similar or equivalent. There was a whole debate about whether Iraq was precursor, right? And that's a violation of the just war principles. But then to do it with a clobber is a whole new, it's inventing a whole new, the rationale we have for war is that you had it coming, this thing, and if we were to be merciful, we would say, yeah, but we'll offer compassion instead. But instead of lex talionis, it was no, we're going to come down so hard that our perception is that you're already across lines we can't even prove, and we're going to shut you down. So this is sort of a continuum to me, is that And I know I'm way out in the stratosphere here, but the point is, I'm going to get around to addiction in a minute, but it's this continuum between lex exuberus, or whatever, like way too high of a response, to reciprocal justice, which is where the punishment sort of meets the crime, and then reciprocal mercy, when we think that consequences are due, and what we offer instead is gentleness, love, forgiveness, letting go, right? I never went after Bob for his money after I had this profound experience. I just wrote it off. I did write it off, of course, on my taxes as bad debt, but... and you're not allowed to go after that afterwards, but... I lost my place. The phenomenon of addiction brings us to the sense of due consequences, really is an important thread. My guess is each of you can think about who's been mad at you, who has felt that you have screwed up their lives, who has felt that you have ruined the holiday gathering, you have burnt the family money, you have embarrassed the family lot, and then you might have a job thing that's going on, you're like either teetering or already fired, you might have the law against you, and I mean, half the guys that were in that NA meeting in jail were there because of drugs. More than half. They say approximately 3/4 of incarcerations in the United States today are somehow substance use disorder related. One of the things that mitigates the sense of shame for us is learning about disease, realizing that the addiction phenomenon drives the bus of our behavior. That's a non-technical expression, but it captures the sense. Because we do things that are against our own values, much less against the values of the system in which we live. I used to think I was a very honest person, but I lied through my teeth constantly as an addict. And there was this conflict of values. But I learned that, in fact, I probably couldn't have prevented myself from lying when I was full-blown actively using every day, because the using would protect itself. Now, does that mean I'm not accountable for the lying? Actually, it doesn't. What turns out is that other people still suffered because of our behavior. And this is one of these funny, nuanced things, because I think we really like black and white binary thinking, all that sort of stuff, but life is very fuzzy and gray. So it's good to know, as a person suffering from a substance use disorder, that you probably couldn't have done better. That's really important. And I want to say also, as a moral, practical theologian, we are called to take account for who hurt as a consequence of where we ended up. This is when you have like manslaughter instead of murder. Like, this is the distinction in the law between intent and actual consequence. So the actual consequence is real, but your intent was not there, right? I didn't wake up in the morning and go, I'm going to mess up everybody in my life. I didn't. I woke up every morning like, I wonder how I'm going to get high. That was the driving impulse. And people suffered as a result. So I have due consequences staring at me from the years before, and actually, sadly, from things I've done sober. And you probably do too. Don't raise your hands, but my guess is there's one or two people in the room who are thinking, if I were to get what I deserve. And karma and Abrahamic faith has this whole idea of the scales of justice and balance, and what you have coming back at you is about commensurate with what you put out there. If you think that that's what holds sway in the universe in the end, is lex talionis. Every time I hear one of my patients say, I believe in karma, I'm like, yeah, I get it, but I want better than karma. Because I don't want the karma crap that's coming back at me. I want an out. And I don't want my children, my grandchildren, to pay the price for the sins of the father visited on the other generations, right? Is there an out? Or is cosmic balance the only thing that is at play? I don't believe cosmic balance is the only thing that's at play. And one of the things that people notice is that, hey, like really rotten people, thrive, and then really good people suffer. So that seems to call into question the notions of lex talionis and the universal sort of balance or karmic equivalency, except that the karmic traditions then go, oh, it'll come in the next generation. Okay. But what I want to do is I want to say that I have come to believe that mercy is a real thing. And that if you study the Abrahamic traditions, which I have this idea of a God, it is in the essential nature of God to be merciful and just. Weird. Like, how can you be both merciful and just? That's a question I'm taking with me. It's not a paradox, it's a dialectic. The God of our understanding is at times merciful and at times allows justice to exact its price. One of my favorite theologians talked about the dance between an all-powerful God and an all-loving God, and said similarly, it would appear you can't have both. I haven't solved this on the justice mercy thing, unless I talk about Shakespeare in a second, but in the power and love thing, I mentioned him last week, Doug Meeks said to me, there's another one of the Doug Meeks sentences, that God's power is love, and God's love is power. If you would chew on that for a moment, it's really beguilingly, extraordinarily cool as an intellectual manipulation. What if it is the case that an all-powerful divinity exercising that power is love? And if the love of that divinity is, in essence, that divinity's power, then the fear of God, the wrath of God, the terror of God is slightly misplaced. I remember my catechism, So I understand that it's not necessarily the predominant view, but I also really have this feeling in my soul that there is something deep and true in this. When Jesus teaches his followers to pray, using this thing that is controversial in the recovery movement, the Lord's Prayer, he says, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. That's mercy. And the notion here is that just like karma, there's reciprocal mercy. We will receive mercy if we will extend mercy. On a larger scale, I believe that must be true. And that sadly what's happened in this world that we're in right now is that people have stopped being merciful. And as a result, we have way less mercy going around. But we could inaugurate difference here and now today with us, locally, one at a time. If you seek to be viewed mercifully, be merciful. And this is not just with Bob's. This is with yourself in the mirror. And this is with God, who you may have said, forget God. I'm done with God. Could you be charitable and gracious towards the divine power that you feel has wronged you? It's a stretch, perhaps. But unless we interject more mercy into the world, it's sort of unfair for us to ask for it. There's fairness. Later, you're going to hear a reading, which is a reading from The Merchant of Venice, Marnie, and I love this particular text. It's beautiful. And one of the phrases in it is, when mercy seasons justice. Right? It's a beautiful idea that the power being exerted by authority should be seasoned by mercy. And I pray that would be true in your life, in my life, in our lives, in our time, and right now in whatever the circumstances that bring you here. I think it's on us to bring the spirit of charity, mercy, and love, instead of a spirit of blame and rejection and hostility and rage and alienation. It's a choice we have. And a powerful choice. To speak out of love, or to go all Yellowstone on Monday.